Let's begin with a simple fact. The Bible is very clear about incest, sexual relations between close family members such as a brother and sister. In the Old Testament of the Bible, in the book of Leviticus chapter 18 and 20, God lists incest as a sin, a shameful, detestable, and abominable act. These are not vague moral suggestions. These are strong labels from God Himself, meaning, in God's eyes, this is wrong. But here comes the contradiction. The same God supposedly created the human race through incest, the very act He calls shameful and detestable. According to the Christian creation story, God created only one man, Adam, then only one woman, Eve, and the entire human race came from their children. Think about that for a moment. This means the very foundation of humanity was brother-sister reproduction. So the same God who calls incest a sin, a shameful and detestable act, also made it the only way humans could exist. Now, some Christians defend the story by saying, without this process, God could not have raised humankind from the first man, which was necessary for His plan to redeem humanity through Jesus. In other words, they argue that God allowed incest at the beginning as part of His divine plan. It was a necessary step to ensure the entire human race descended from one man so that salvation through Jesus could later take place. But this creates a serious moral problem. God's plan required an act He calls detestable and sinful. Leviticus chapter 18 clearly calls incest a shameful, detestable, and abominable act. If God Himself labels it as immoral, how can He use it as a tool for salvation without contradicting His own moral standard? It portrays God's plan as morally inconsistent. Then Christians argue God allowed incest for a higher purpose. But in His own law, the act is eternally immoral. That means God's plan deliberately involves an abominable act, something no morally perfect being would do. The moral contradiction cannot be excused by plan of salvation. Saying it was necessary for redemption does not remove the fact that the method was ethically sinful in God's own eyes. A morally perfect God should be able to accomplish His plan without committing or requiring immoral acts. So the bottom line is, using a shameful and detestable act to achieve a divine goal does not make the act morally acceptable. It exposes a contradiction in the character of God as described in the Bible. Another common defense by Christians is this: maybe incest was not a sin at the start. It only became sinful later when it started causing health problems and genetic defects. But here is the catch. The Bible never says this. Nowhere does the Bible suggest that incest was ever permissible at the beginning or that it only became sinful later because of health or genetic problems. In fact, the Bible never links incest to any of these issues at all. It simply calls it shameful, detestable, and abominable. So these are just modern excuses trying to patch an ancient contradiction. The Bible uses three strong moral words: abomination, detestable, and shameful. These words describe the act itself, not the circumstances. If something is an abomination in God's eyes, it is always an abomination. And according to Christian doctrine, God does not change. So if incest is sinful today, it was sinful from the start, which means God used a sinful act to build humanity. So what does all this mean? If Christians truly believe that God created humanity through a process He Himself calls shameful, detestable, and abominable, then they are forced to admit the foundation of humanity was morally disgusting in God's own eyes. A perfect God does not start the human race with an act He labels as detestable. This contradiction is not minor. It hits at the very heart of biblical morality. And in the end, this contradiction doesn't just expose the moral failure of the creation story. It exposes the character of the Christian God Himself. And that character, in turn, exposes a deeper truth. The God of the Bible is not a perfect holy being, but a reflection of the flawed and often perverted imagination of the ancient human minds who created him.